Final Fantasy. 2 words, dozens of titles, and countless feelings of nostalgia, grandeur, and wanderlust. This franchise has become one of the largest intellectual properties in the world, and the RPG genre as a whole owes much of its DNA to the many innovations made by this iconic series. It's gotten so big, in fact, that it's easy to forget the humble origins of this role-playing monolith. Hi there, my name is Daniel, and I think Final Fantasy, the first one, is pretty creative. Alright, confession time. I have never actually completed a Final Fantasy game. I know, it's blasphemy, especially considering how much I love RPGs. And believe me, I've had plenty of exposure to the series throughout my life. 7 to 10 were staples in the George household when I was growing up, and 15 gave me a ton of enjoyment, until Breath of the Wild came out a few months later. Heck, I've even played the entire Kingdom Hearts series to death and love the characters and scenarios Square Enix brings to the table. But for some reason, I've just missed these games up until this point. And it's a real shame, because it's honestly hard to find a series that encapsulates the word legendary more than this one. In fact, the title Final Fantasy has become almost synonymous with the RPG genre itself. But it wasn't always that way. Before they were the RPG powerhouse they are today, Square Enix, called Squaresoft at the time, was in some pretty dire straits back in 1987. Finances were tight, and after a slew of unsuccessful titles, Square was looking bankruptcy dead in the eye. But then, a ray of hope illuminated these dark times when Dragon Quest was released a year prior, bringing the recent success of Super Mario Bros., which had reinvigorated the video game industry, to the RPG genre. Square developer Hironobu Sakaguchi had been wanting to create an RPG for a long time, but had been denied on the assumption that such games wouldn't be financially successful. But after the overwhelming success of Dragon Quest, the financially insecure Square was strongly encouraged to reconsider. Now, this backstory is no secret, and Final Fantasy's remarkable development has certainly garnered its fair share of urban legends over the years. And while the legitimacy of the claims that the word final stems from the company's desperate financial situation have been disputed by some, I think it's safe to say that Squaresoft's groundbreaking title was certainly in a do-or-die situation. Which is why it's fascinating to me, as someone who's never completed a single game in this now globally celebrated series, to return to its humble roots with this title. What could have possibly brought Squaresoft from its terminal bed rest to the absolute leviathan, no pun intended there, it is today? Well, I can tell you it certainly wasn't the game's narrative scenario. Now, hold on. Before you go filling the comments section with outbursts about my lack of intelligence, hear me out. For those who are unfamiliar, Final Fantasy sees you step into the shoes of 4 avatars called the Warriors of Light, who have been called by prophecy to restore power to the 4 elemental infinity stones, I mean crystals, and bring light to the world that has fallen into darkness. Okay, par for the course for a fantasy story, right? And by no means is this narrative bad or anything. In fact, I'd argue quite the opposite, as it's an archetype that's been used plenty of times over the years. Nameless hero called by destiny? Check. Asked to rescue a princess and collect some magical objects to save the world? Also check. And I get it, it's epic yet concise, which was the sweet spot for these first-generation adventures with limited storytelling capacity. And not only that, but the collectible key items create a natural, chapter-like progression that splits the game into more easily digestible chunks. But even in 1987, this had already been done plenty of times before. So in that sense, no, it's not the most original. But I gotta say, having the game's true antagonist be a physical embodiment of the chaos that set in motion the 2,000-year reign of destruction preceding the game's story is pretty tight. And the fact that Chaos ends up really being the first boss you fought after he traveled back in time was also a pretty cool twist. Heck, Dragon Quest never messed around with time loops, so 1 point to Squaresoft for that one. And speaking of Dragon Quest, it's pretty much impossible to not compare this game to the 2 Chunsoft classics that preceded it. Of course, Final Fantasy's inspirations go deeper than it simply being a Dragon Quest clone. But I mean, the influences here are obvious. So obvious, in fact, that we're not going to waste our time talking about them. Instead, I want to focus on how Final Fantasy took the foundation laid out by Dragon Quest and experimented with it in some truly fascinating ways. But before we get into the big obvious stuff, let's cover some smaller details, lightning round style. Taking a quick look at the map will present any RPG fan with a familiar sight. You got a few continents with some varied geography here and there, all connected by a vast ocean. And much like Dragon Quest II before it, this adventure will see you traveling by foot as well as by boat. But the later half of the game also introduces another form of travel that would be seen as a staple of the Final Fantasy franchise, the airship. And then there's the differences in what's actually on these continents. Dragon Quest laid out an exploration formula of visiting castles, towns, and dungeons which were scattered around the game's world. But even in the first 2 Dragon Quest games, it's clear to see that the balance in their locations was weighted in favor of friendly settlements rather than menacing dungeons. But in Final Fantasy, it's actually the opposite. Here's a list of towns and dungeons in Dragon Quest II, for instance. And here are the towns and dungeons in Final Fantasy. And it makes sense. Squaresoft's world has been enduring destruction from the 4 fiends for centuries, and the lack of many civilizations, as well as the large number of monster dens, reflects that. Even more than Dragon Quest before it, Final Fantasy takes an enormous amount of inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons, and the game's combat feels about as faithful a translation of D&D gameplay as you could possibly get on the NES. But of course, as you've likely already noticed, I'm not playing on the NES. No, I'm playing this as well as Final Fantasy II, stay tuned for that, on the Game Boy Advance as part of the Dawn of Souls collection. As with Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy has seen a dizzying amount of ports and remakes over the years, but for my money, Dawn of Souls is where it's at. And yes, I know we got the Pixel remasters earlier this year, which look and sound great, but this GBA double feature contains a ton of quality of life improvements and adds a fair amount of post-game content to both titles, both of which are surprisingly absent from the NES remasters. Now there is, of course, the matter of how magic works in the game, as the GBA port saw the removal of the original's D&D-inspired spell slot magic system in favor of the more familiar MP-based system used by later series titles. And while I do think this change takes away from the title's unique identity a bit, this isn't nearly as big a deal to me as the additional content. And at the end of the day, all of these version differences, like the soundtrack and changes in sprite work, boil down to a matter of opinion, and I personally found that Dawn of Souls was the version for me. Regardless of version differences though, you're here to talk about the combat. And oh boy, does Final Fantasy do some fascinating things with its RPG mechanics. But before we get started talking about the battles themselves, we need to start at the very beginning. Like starting a new save file beginning. The first challenge Final Fantasy presents you with upon starting your adventure, before the prologue, before even seeing the world, is the creation of your party. Right off the bat, you're asked to name and assign classes to your 4 party members. I know this is technically the predecessor to the series' job system, but seeing as it wouldn't be formally introduced until 3, I'm calling these classes for the sake of this title. And in this title, you got 6 of them. The fighter class fills the role of your classic RPG warrior trope. No magic, just armor and weapons. Then you've got your other melee classes, the agile thief and the brawler monk. And on the magical end of the spectrum, there's the white mage who specializes in healing and party buffs, as well as the black mage, who's going to be your heavy-hitting glass cannon with all the most powerful damaging spells. And to top it all off, there's the red mage, a unique jack-of-all-trades class that was actually my favorite to play around with throughout my adventure. They can equip a variety of armor and weapons, as well as a limited number of both black and white magic spells. The sheer level of customization on offer here is so exciting to me on a number of levels. The first 2 Dragon Quest games took me on adventures, sure, but with the ability to create my own party, this could truly be my adventure. And don't even get me started on replay value. I went with what I thought was a pretty balanced mix of classes in my party, but on a second playthrough, I would love to see what effect switching out my red mage for a white mage would have. And the sheer thought of a full party of black mages spamming Firaga is absolutely hilarious to me. Every possible party composition comes with its own set of strengths and weaknesses, and it's a testament to the game's balancing that all of these classes felt like interesting and useful options. I mean, there's definitely ways to break this game, don't get me wrong. Stacking buffs to demolish chaos, anyone? But generally speaking, it's really impressive to me how Square managed to present 6 valuable options to choose from that modulate the game's difficulty in unique ways. My only complaint about the way you're forced to choose these classes from the outset is that there's no way to tell how useful each class will actually be until you start playing the game. For instance, I didn't know until I started shopping for spells that my lack of a white mage locked me out of some of these really useful ones. I'm totally great dealing with the consequences of my choices. I just would like to know what I'm committing to on the front end. But figuring out your team comp is only the beginning. It wasn't until I really dug my heels into Final Fantasy that I began to truly appreciate the definition and structure it brought to the role-playing foundation laid out by Dragon Quest. One of my gripes with the simplicity of the first 2 Dragon Quest games was the lack of strategy potential in those adventures. But here, you've got enemy weaknesses and resistances to count for. You've got weapons that can be used to cast elemental magic. You can freaking change your entire party's weapon setup mid-battle if you want to. That one was crazy for me when I first realized it. And nowhere does this depth and complexity shine through more than in the game's magic system. Dragon Quest may have introduced magic, and its sequel dabbled with a better mix of offensive and defensive spells. But in Final Fantasy, you're given a whole host of magical options with a wide range of applications. And not only that, but each spell is assigned a level, 1 through 8, that determines whether or not your character is strong enough to use it. Higher spell levels equal stronger spells. This gives your magic a nice sense of progression, and it's nice to have all your available spells organized in an intuitive way like this, rather than just being displayed in the order you got them. But there's a catch, because you didn't think you'd just be able to load up on all of these, did you? No, in the same way the game makes you commit to your party comp, it also limits each magically able character to 3 spells per spell level. These spells can be discarded and replaced whenever you choose, but doing so permanently trashes them, and you can never have more than 3 for each tier. Honestly, I love this, because as powerful as it is to provide the player with choices, it's equally important what kinds of limitations are imposed on those choices. Opening some doors closes others, and isn't that true of life in general? Providing consequences for a player's actions, both positive and negative, creates memorable, unique experiences that aren't always there in games where you can just do everything. Every choice you make in this adventure, the team and playstyle you set out with, the armor and weapons you equip, and the magic you choose to learn, stacks up so that by the time this happens, your experience is already wholly unique to you. And this feeling of ownership was so powerful for me that even the more frustrating aspects of the game, like the intense difficulty spikes and backtracking through dozens of random encounters, were less of a bother in my experience. Final Fantasy requires players to commit to their choices, both big and small. And there's freedom in those choices, sure, but once you confirm your selections, there's no turning back. And I think that experience of choosing your path and seeing it through is one of the most important things Final Fantasy brought to the world of gaming. For starters, being locked into my path made the game feel refreshingly simple for an RPG, as I wasn't constantly overwhelmed with a staggering amount of choices to completely change around my team comp. And then there's replay value. I'm not even going to try to calculate the amount of possible class combinations you can choose from. I'm sure someone else has probably posted it online somewhere. But the amazing fact remains that for something as simple as choosing your party at the beginning of the game, the sheer number of possible unique outcomes is really impressive. But aside from just contributing to an enjoyable experience, the choice-driven crux of Final Fantasy reminds me of the humbling reality of my daily life. Time only flows forwards, not backwards. And as much as I would love to redo the mistakes I've made or to go back and see what choosing a different path would have led to, my present day is the only thing I really have agency over. The life I live today is the culmination of the choices I've made and the circumstances I've been given. And I think that's a gift. Are there circumstances I would love to change? Absolutely. But for better or for worse, my choices have helped shape the man I am today. And the person I become tomorrow will be shaped by the choices I make right now. So instead of dwelling on the past or obsessing over the future, I want to commit to the present. What choices am I faced with today? And what path do I want to choose? Now, I don't know where your heart is at today, whether you're satisfied and comfortable in your own skin, or frustrated and overwhelmed with your circumstances. But if I could just ask, would you take this step with me? Let's think about today and the choices within. What type of person do you want to be? I want to be someone who walks with joy and speaks life and truth to others. And that's the path I'm going to choose. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button to stay in the loop. We'll be bringing it back to Dragon Quest here in a couple weeks, so hit that notification bell so you can know when it's live. God bless you guys. Hope y'all have a wonderful, joy-filled day.